Leadership Beyond Profits, a Social Justice Approach, a 6-part workshop series presented by the InMotion Network. I'm Frankie Harrogate, I'll be your facilitator today, and I'm the Vice Chair of the InMotion Board, a member of the Physical Activity Committee, Chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and a member of the HR Committee. We will take a moment to acknowledge that many of us are situated on Treaty 6, 7, and 8 territory, traditional gathering places for diverse Indigenous peoples, and to state our respect for the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. This is Workshop 2 in a 6-part series. Today's workshop focuses on power and privilege in leadership, moving toward justice. In this workshop, we are going to talk about how vital it is to consider power and privilege in the context of leadership, and the importance of moving from reality to equality and to equity and justice. Again, we suggest you pause the presentation at this slide to take some time to consider the suggested pre-workshop exercise. You may want to do this in writing or in your head. For this workshop, ask yourself the following before engaging with the presentation. 1. What is your understanding of the concept of power and privilege, and how may they relate to your leadership? 2. What does equality, equity, and justice mean to you? Things to keep in mind during the workshop. What might be some areas in which you need improvement in terms of seeing power and privilege at play? Where on the spectrum between equality, equity, and justice do your ideas about fairness fall? In Workshop 1, we provided an overview of the mainstream leadership style frameworks that dominate how leadership is thought about. We pointed to a number of gaps. There's little consideration of follower characteristics. There's often, or perhaps always, a gap between leadership style and how someone implements it in practice, and that these frameworks are skewed towards capitalist measures of success, focusing on profits, efficiency, and winning. Today, we will start addressing these gaps by talking about equality, equity, and justice, how these concepts are related to power and privilege, the impact of fragility, and how it can be mitigated by anti-oppressive approaches. We will then look at what these concepts can tell us about follower characteristics and follower types. Let's start with equality and equity. For our purposes, it can be reduced to this. Equality happens when everyone gets the same thing, a universal resource. Equity is a bit more nuanced. It happens when everyone gets what they need, which is different from every individual and from group to group. It's obvious that focusing on equality versus equity results in very different outcomes. As illustrated in this popular cartoon, equity does not result in access for all. It's obvious that focusing on equality versus equity results in very different outcomes. As illustrated in this popular cartoon, equality does not result in access for all, whereas equity does. It is not uncommon for goals and objectives to be defined in terms of equality, especially as organizations get larger and larger. Using this comic as an example, that's because it's easier to quantify success if you operationalize it by saying our group's goal is to supply a box to every individual in this community, rather than our goal is to distribute boxes in such a way that everyone can see the game. It's not hard to imagine that it's easier to just identify individuals and get a box to them, rather than assess an individual's need for boxes and distribute according to that assessment. What's different between equality and equity from a leadership perspective then? In this example, if an equitable goal is set instead of one focused on equality, it means recognizing and accommodating for the fact that an equitable outcome requires more time and effort. This is why capitalist measures of success, such as efficiency, are less useful in nonprofit settings. It simply takes more time to support equity over equality. An Alberta example is Kleinbucks. In 2006, our provincial government sent $400 to almost 3 million Alberta residents. It was essentially a dividend payment from a provincial budget surplus that resulted from very high oil prices in that time period. Eligibility was based on simple residency at a specific time. This is an example of an equal distribution of a resource that, many argue, could have been done much more equitably. There are many criticisms of this, but one of the most robust is that that money could have either been added to the principal in the Alberta Heritage Savings Fund, or it could have provided a funding boost to social service organizations, the latter of which means that it would help those who needed assistance most, rather than a general distribution of dollars to everyone, whether they needed it or not. From a leadership perspective, we can ask, why might the provincial government choose to do this? We can only speculate, but some folks believe that it was to shore up support for the governing party. Some believe it was a bit of a flex to other provinces, and they may also have had the best of intentions in thinking, hey, maybe we should share the wealth. It's easy to see why such an approach would have popular support. Depending on your circumstances, $400 could be a huge difference maker, or it could buy you and yours a very nice meal out. But if that pool of money had been invested in, say, post-secondary education, perhaps students today might not be struggling so much. Or might there be fewer housing insecure folks in our province today if that money had been put toward alleviating housing challenges? We will never know, but we can and we should learn from this initiative and be mindful of the lost opportunities. We would say that there are few, if any, exceptions when it comes to equitable outcomes being preferable to equal ones. But we think that there is even more to consider when we step back a little more and consider the world that we live in. Inequality is ever increasing, so in whatever domain of social justice we are working in, we have to assess the current reality. Just how far are we right now from equality and from equity? Justice, in this case interchangeable with liberation, is the removal of barriers to access that existed in the first place. Continuing to use this baseball game comic example then, justice happens when the fence blocking the view is removed entirely. The thing about social justice work is that if we're successful, we become obsolete. If we take down the fence, we don't need the boxes at all. If we cure cancer, we don't need to figure out how to improve access to cancer treatments. That said, rarely can we focus only on justice because in the meantime, we still need equity until the barrier is gone, just as how we must work toward a cure for cancer until that happens. That said, rarely can we focus only on justice because in the meantime, we still need equity until the barrier is gone, just as how we must work toward a cure for cancer, but until it happens, we must help as many folks with cancer access treatment as is possible. When you apply this to leadership, it leaves you with this. A good leader makes themselves obsolete by either leading a group to eliminate a problem or by passing the torch to someone who is just as or more capable. Leadership should always be dynamic and never assumed to be permanent. Effective leaders have to be adaptable and also prepare for a time when their leadership is no longer effective or necessary. We will return to this in the last workshop where we will discuss succession planning as part of responsible leadership. The first frame of the comic illustrates a dramatic difference for access as reality. This is important to consider when facing any social justice problem. Just how big are the existing inequalities? The bigger they are, the more need there is to triage, that is, to engage in damage control. Sometimes this is not easy given how nonprofits are forced to function, as most organizations are stretched beyond their limits as there is constant pressure to do more with less. Sometimes this is not easy given how nonprofits are forced to function, as most organizations are often stretched beyond their limits as there is constant pressure to do as much as possible with as little as possible. This is a capitalist approach to success. Even in corporate settings where, in theory, resources are more bountiful, it may not be accessible to certain domains, especially if investing in those domains is not easily linked with profitability. When an organization applies for a grant, a number of assumptions have to be made, including, but not limited to, the current scope of the problem, the willingness of a community to work on that problem, and the relationship of an organization to the affected community. Funders rarely have information beyond what's provided in applications, so there's no easy way to assess whether the activities for which they are requesting funds are realistic or likely to be effective. A different group with closer ties to a community may well have better strategies to deal with a problem, but if they do not have a savvy grant writer, access to support may not be possible for them. Continuing with this example then, a leader of an organization that wants to help some particular domain needs to connect with those most affected by whatever problem they want to help solve, and this takes time, energy, and skill. This work lets those in leadership roles get a better sense of the reality and what needs to be done to move toward justice. A strong leader would also be able to recruit motivated followers who want to contribute. We believe all societal problems can be directly linked to issues of power and privilege in our society. Yet funding models and most application processes have not managed to account for the influence of power and privilege that affects those who receive support. Yet funding models and most application processes have not managed to account for the influence of power and privilege that affects who exactly receives support. Strong leadership can absolutely work toward improving this access problem, but it is an ongoing process, and unfortunately we are far from achieving it. Note that it is nearly always easier to work under existing power structures than to change them. That said, it is also often not as difficult as one would think to work differently. Let's consider how funding opportunities, while typically presented as universally accessible opportunities to organizations doing similar types of work, are in fact heavily affected by a number of factors that actually mean access is not the same for all. Application for funding timelines. Most funding opportunities have specific deadlines. Sometimes these deadlines are a long way off, sometimes they require a relatively quick response. On the surface, it seems that these timelines, since they're the same for everyone interested in applying for any one particular program, provide the same equal opportunity for all interested parties, since the application process is the same for all interested parties, right? Except this doesn't account for the diversity of organizations in terms of resources available to work on funding applications. Larger organizations often have people in roles dedicated to finding resources to do the work, while smaller ones have the responsibility for finding resources and continuing the work tends to be shared amongst many individuals who are already also responsible for a myriad of tasks. Some nonprofits have no paid staff whatsoever and are entirely volunteer run. Regardless of the time available, it will be easier for organizations who have a dedicated team working on funding applications to put together whatever is necessary to apply compared to organizations dependent on a few individuals who also have a multitude of other responsibilities. This inequality is further magnified in situations where smaller organizations may have a single individual responsible for drafting an application, and if something happens in that individual's life that interferes with their ability to get the application together, things are unfortunately compromised. This discrepancy can be exacerbated by other factors as well. Organizations who have an existing relationship with a potential funder are more likely to become aware of a funding opportunity sooner than organizations without an existing relationship, which magnifies the impact of having more or less resources available to put together an application. It could be something as simple as overworked individuals not seeing an email announced in a flooded inbox. Prior experience with funding applications also give more established organizations an advantage over those with less experience. There are also downstream impacts. If a smaller organization has to scramble to put together a funding application, it may mean having to sacrifice time spent on program delivery or other work, while larger organizations with dedicated resources put toward funding would not have to make a similar sacrifice. What ends up happening then is that most approaches to funding nonprofit organizations end up increasing the resource gap between larger and smaller organizations, and there are unrecognized ripple effects that affect the primary work these organizations are engaged in. If we apply the funding opportunity example to the 4-panel comic, it would break down this way. Reality. Organizations whose activities fit under a particular funding opportunity do not have the same level of resources available to put together an application. Equality. A funding opportunity is seen as accessible to all interested parties based on the fact that the process and deadlines are the same for all. Equity. If a funding body recognizes that fulfilling the same requirements disproportionately asks for more from smaller organizations, there are some things that can be done differently to shift toward equity. For example, longer timelines would make an opportunity more accessible to smaller organizations that have fewer staff. Providing funding for longer terms, for example, funding a project for multiple years versus an annual program, would also reduce the proportion of time spent on applying for that money, and also let organizations of any size focus more on program delivery than on securing funding. Justice. To continue with this example, what might a socially just approach to nonprofit funding look like? We don't have the answer to that, but we do have some ideas. Reduce as much as possible the labor that would be required to assemble an application. Funding bodies can invest in staff whose job is to assist interested organizations in applying instead of having all of the labor come from the applying organizations. Ongoing opportunities versus dollars tied to specific deadlines. More centralized funding distribution models where funding bodies can pool their resources so that organizations can submit one big application package versus multiple packages with slightly different requirements to numerous programs. Shifting gears a little, let's step back and look at power and privilege and why they are important to consider in a leadership context. For our purposes, it's helpful to think of power in these ways. Power is having control, authority, or influence over others. It can present as legal or official authority, capacity or right, and more generally, it describes political control and influence. The concept of privilege is closely related. The dictionary defines it as a right or immunity granted as a particular benefit, advantage, or favor. A more nuanced social justice definition that we found at the Colors of Resistance archive describes it as an unearned social power given by formal and informal institutions of society given to all members of a dominant group, and crucially, that privilege is usually invisible to those who have it. If we continue with the example we were just discussing about the structure of funding opportunities, power rests in the hands of those who decide how funding is distributed and those who choose what the application process looks like. And larger organizations with dedicated human resources focused on securing funding are in a more privileged position compared to smaller organizations. Going back to the reality, equality, equity, justice spectrum then, how does power and privilege relate to moving towards justice? We believe it's actually really simple, theoretically, but way more difficult practically. It's about using one's power and privilege, or leveraging the power and privilege of allied others, which is something we'll return to in a later workshop, to move towards a more just world. Crucially though, and on a daily process level, it's about being mindful of one's power and privilege. Because if we accept that those who have privilege often find that it's invisible, we need to constantly work at being aware of ours and help others see theirs. The how comes from anti-oppression. Before we talk about that though, we must discuss briefly the biggest barrier to working on movement toward justice: fragility. Fragility comes from the concept of fragile, meaning easily broken or destroyed. In a social justice context, blank fragility refers to members of a dominant group becoming defensive when they hear criticism of a dominant group they belong to, or when they have their personal privilege called out. Some examples. A woman shares that she had a scary experience where it seemed a stranger followed her out of a restaurant, and as she walked toward her car, she became increasingly alarmed that she was in danger. Others shared similar experiences. Someone shares the sentiment, "Ugh, men are terrible." A man jumps in. "Not all men are like that. Some of us are good men and would never harm another person." A Chinese woman shares that she was annoyed when she received an unsolicited comment about, "Your English is so good." Others share similar experiences. Someone shares the sentiment, "Ugh, white people." A white person jumps in. "Not all white people are racist, and we experience racism too. I once went to a Chinese restaurant and without asking, they just brought me a fork." A white person says, "I think police abuse of power is a problem, but I think Black Lives Matter is racist because all lives matter." Here's the thing, because dominant groups, men and white people, have power over others, and power is always relative, so the point is that they have power over non-men and non-white people. Those groups do not have the power to turn sexism and racism around or to reverse it. It is absolutely possible for generalizations to be made about dominant groups, and it is uncomfortable to hear, and probably more so if one sees themselves as having actively acted in a sexist or racist way. However, centering the feelings of a dominant group over the very real dangers, often to actual lives, further marginalizes these groups and actually increases the power of the dominant group. When men or white people do this, they are actively contributing to and upholding the patriarchy and white supremacy, even if that is not their intent. At its most simple, fragility can be summed up with this: feeling uncomfortable is not the same as being oppressed. The energy spent centering dominant group members' feelings is energy better spent changing the actions of other members of their own dominant group. What does that look like? Men actively engaging with other men on issues of violence against non-men, such as calling out a joke about beating one's wife or children. Intervening in public when seeing a woman receiving unwanted attention or harassment from another man. White people speaking up about cultural appropriation or police brutality, offering to accompany someone of color to their destination if we know that attacks are on the rise against a specific group. And it's particularly relevant right now given the attacks on Muslim women here in Alberta. The flip side of fragility is anti-oppression. Since oppression is the unjust or cruel exercise of authority or power, anti-oppression are ways of thinking or acting to reduce and eliminate oppression. It involves active engagement. Every day you have to choose to think and act in anti-oppressive ways. It requires an ongoing, almost constant process of self-reflection, something we'll return to in Workshop 6, because it's about constantly checking yourself until it becomes a habit and then a reflex. It's about listening to and amplifying marginalized voices and recognizing that no matter how much you've studied something or how much you care about a particular issue, there are folks who's lived it, whose voices need to be heard more than yours. It's about recognizing and acknowledging mistakes and failures in ways that lead to learning. It's about accepting your membership in certain dominant groups and accepting that you are in part responsible for how that group relates to the rest of the world, even if you only just became aware of it, since you have been benefiting from the previously invisible privilege that you now see. It's about working for change once you know, or more often, I think, are shown about your part in it. Anti-oppression should be a core component of leadership, and it comes with the recognition that simply being in a leadership role comes with power and privilege, regardless of all other social identities. One of the things that was a key takeaway from Workshop 1 was the gap in considering follower characteristics, since the focus of leadership styles are on the characteristics of those leadership styles. If we accept that leadership from a social justice perspective goes beyond working on social justice issues, and that it is important to lead in a way that is consistent with moving from reality to justice, then we need to consider the following. Reality. Followers are unique individuals and change over time. Equality. Treating all followers as the same, by and large, what the mainstream approach does. Equity. Recognizing followers have different needs and wants, and a good leader would lead accordingly. Justice. Making space for followers to contribute in their own ways and in their own time within their capacity. If we are to lead in ways consistent with moving from reality toward justice, when it comes to those under our leadership, we need to keep in mind social identity considerations. What dominant groups does this person belong to? What marginalized groups does this person belong to? How might those group memberships affect that individual? Psychological considerations. These are more explicit preferences connected to how a follower might prefer to be treated, and many of these can be viewed as a continuum. For example, does someone prefer to be given very specific tasks with measurable outcomes, or have lots of freedom in fulfilling a particular objective? Does someone prefer simple, repetitive tasks, or cognitively complex, problem-solving type tasks? For this workshop, we ask that you consider the following when reflecting on this content. How do you see the relationship between power, privilege, and leadership now? Can you map your own experiences to the reality, equality, equity, justice spectrum? Did the material presented in this workshop influence your perspective on what effective leadership might look like? The recommended reading for this workshop is a book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. This book focuses on how to take action as an anti-racist, but it's easily generalizable to anti-oppression more generally. A quote from the book that parallels what it takes to be an effective leader. Quote, "Being an anti-racist requires persistent self-awareness, constant self-criticism, and regular self-examination." End quote. For the next workshop, we will explore follower characteristics relevant to leadership. They can be individual variables, social identities, membership in various groups and communities, and also personal circumstances. For example, a leader should have different expectations of someone who has just had a significant life change, like a marriage, divorce, or baby. Once we have some variables to consider, we will then explore how leaders might accommodate the uniqueness of individual followers, keeping in mind the concepts of equality, equity, and justice. We will then discuss what fairness looks like when leadership recognizes individual differences and capacity, and then close with a discussion on inclusion and exclusion.